Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Jackson from Totally Runnable and welcome to Gender, Stereotypes, Sport and Life After Lockdown. This is a webinar that I am pre-recording, so I'll be sending this out. Feel free to share this with anybody that you know. It is particularly aimed at those who work in schools in England. So we work with a lot of schools, particularly primary schools, and we do a lot of work around gender stereotypes, particularly in sport. But obviously at the moment we are dealing with a lockdown situation, life after lockdown, what's happened, what effect has the lockdown had on gender stereotypes in general? Has it had any impact on sport? What are we seeing in the schools that we're working in? So hopefully over the next half hour or so, I will give you some of the statistics, some stories from things that we've seen in other schools, and get you thinking about what's going on in your school. I will end with 3 top tips, quick wins for how you can take the gender sport gap in your school and move things forward, close that gap. Or do you have a gender sport gap? The first of my 3 tips will help you think about whether you have a gender sport gap and think about how you can move your school forward. So thank you for joining me. If you are receiving this as part of the Girls in Sport Pledge, you signed up to our free Girls in Sport Pledge, then that's brilliant. You are already getting our newsletters, our free resources, sessions like this. You will already have had your sticker and your certificate to say you are part of the Girls in Sport Pledge and doing more for girls in sport. So whether you are already doing more or you are acknowledging the need and you want to know where to start in terms of doing more for girls in sport because you see the messages, you hear the messages that girls and boys are getting about gender and sport, whichever of those you are or your school is, sign up to our pledge. It's completely free. If you just Google Girls and Sport Pledge or Totally Runnable Girls and Sport Pledge, you will find the sign up page and you will get everything you need from that. If not, if you haven't signed up already, please sign up. It is, as I say, completely free, and it will definitely give you more information and more how to, where to go from this stage in terms of the gender sport gap, particularly if you work in a school and particularly within a primary school. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. If you're just listening to the audio of this, I will explain what's on the screen, but we do have a screen to go with us. And yes, today is all about gender stereotypes and sport after lockdown. So here we are. First question is, who am I? So let's get that up. Who am I? I am Natalie Jackson. I'm one of the directors of Totally Runnable. I have been working for Totally Runnable for about 6 years now. We founded the company in 2015 officially, but several months before that in terms of content and what we were delivering. And Totally Runnable is all about using running as a tool to talk about gender stereotypes, what's going on for children, what messages are they receiving, can we use running as the tool to break down gender stereotypes and help children to be the people that they want to be. We also do work with school staff, so particularly those who are less confident about their own physical ability, but actually anyone across the board we can work with in terms of training up on the kinds of gender stereotypes you might see in school and how to counter those. Totally Runnable, as I say, I've been working for the last 5 years in schools. We work essentially across the north of England, and we are based in Yorkshire. Today's session is about the gender sport gap. It's about stereotypes. It's about thinking about what's going on, and it's about looking into what might be happening in your school or in your life. So in terms of what you're seeing, in terms of your immediate family, in terms of what you're seeing in your school, what's going on? Do you have a gender sport gap in school, and can we start working towards closing that? So today's session, obviously it's not interactive in the sense that you are here live with me, but I am hoping it will be interactive in terms of your thoughts on what's going on for you. So it might be useful for you to have a pen and paper to write some things down, because we are going to start with a few tasks in a minute. First of all, I just wanted to define the gender sport gap. So what we call the gender sport gap, most schools have a gender sport gap when they measure it. particularly primary schools. It isn't most schools' fault. I would never say that it was a school's fault that they have a gender sport gap. Much of existing gender sport gaps relate to the messages sent to girls and boys about being a girl or being a boy and what that means, the stereotypes around what that means, and what they should or shouldn't be into or like doing. And they start super young. I have a toddler, and I know that she is already receiving messages about what girls do, what boys do, what mummies do, what daddies do, and what that all means. And so I am working really hard to do my best in countering that with her, but it's not easy. And I don't believe that you can parent gender neutrally. I think I would love that to be a thing. I would love to be able to do that and to tell my toddler and everybody's children that they can be whoever they want to be, by not talking about gender and by taking the gender out of things. I think at the moment the world is not gender neutral, and so we do need specific targeted messages to girls and to boys to counter the messages they are getting from other places. So that brings us on nicely to our first task. So task 1: where might girls or boys receive messages about gender and what it might mean? So this is something for you to think about and write down. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, but 30 seconds or so to think about places girls or boys might get messages about gender and what that means. I feel like there should be some countdown music, but I don't have any. So some of the things people have said about this task, about messages about gender and where they come from, that girls or boys get, particularly at primary school age, is the wider society. So things like the media, what do they see on TV? Things like their parents, things like teachers, things like books, what's in a book, what are people doing in a book? Things like perhaps within a school, structural sexism that exists within a school that nobody's really thought to question. It's just always been the way it is. So are we always sending boys to go and get the milk and give that out in the classes? Are we always asking boys to move the benches? Are we always asking girls to take the register to reception? What's going on? If you're not doing those things, brilliant, that's great. But actually, there's real value in recognizing why it's important not to do those things, or why it's important to switch who you send to do things, and why you shouldn't say things like, I need 2 big strong boys to move the benches. Particularly by year 6, girls will often have had a growth spurt that boys don't have until year 7 or 8. So actually, the 2 strongest children in your class in year 6 are more likely to be girls than boys. But often when I say that to schools in the training that we deliver, I get a look that says, I may have been assuming otherwise, and I'm not really sure what I've said. So part of today is just thinking about what we're saying and why it's important to say different things. Another one that I see fairly often is there might be a photo in reception. So while I'm waiting in a school reception, I'm a terror for looking around me. And there might be a photo in a school reception of year 5 football team, and it's a picture of boys, and year 5 girls football team, and it's a picture of girls playing football. And I fully understand that. That's, probably your best team might be boys, but that's probably, if that's the case, because they've been training at football for 5 years and girls haven't been encouraged to get into it as young. You might have an amazing girl footballer, but she's likely to be the only one, or one of a couple. It isn't normal to have an even split on your A team of genders, and that's a problem for me. It really shouldn't. Of course it should be the same, but it isn't at the moment. And I can't blame schools for that. Secondly, I would never judge a school for what they're doing, but we can't be critical of schools for that, when actually we have things like the FA Cup and the Women's FA Cup. Until we are calling the Men's FA Cup the Men's FA Cup, and the World Cup and the Women's World Cup, until we're calling the World Cup the Women's World Cup and the Men's World Cup, we can't be critical of schools who are doing that. But actually, what message does it send if we're always seeing that? So that's task number 1. Task number 2, and it's a writing task, but you can think if you're not in a place where you can write. So write down 3 words that describe the impact that COVID-19 and lockdown have had on the children that you work with. So if you work in a school, where are we now? Where are we? So some schools, in what they've said to us from the discussions we've had since the first lockdown, some schools have said that children have come back as they left. So great, there hasn't been a massive detrimental effect on them, but actually they haven't made any progress, and they've come back in September or following that, and they've gone off again and back again, and there's tiers, and there's tier 3, tier 2 for the restrictions. There's all sorts going on around the second lockdown and where we end up after that. But they've seen children come back as they were. But actually, we're more than 6 months down the road from where they were. So that's not good. Some schools have seen children come back heavier, significantly physically heavier. Some children have seen, some schools have seen children come back having done more physical activity than they would normally do. But that's because perhaps there's been less supervision going on, or they've been up to their own devices rather than doing structured, supervised physical activity. So that's not necessarily a good thing either. Most schools that we're speaking to have seen a negative impact on children from missing school, missing the normal school environment. As with a lot of adults, every child and every adult is likely to have been affected by COVID-19, by the lockdowns. One of our values at Totally Runable is being curious. So I'm all about listening to schools and teachers and their experiences. Your experiences is valuable, as are those of the staff you work alongside. So whatever you've written down or whatever you've thought of for the words that describe the impact that lockdown and COVID-19 have had on the children you work with, think about asking your colleagues, think about asking other staff, what are they seeing? If it's not something you're already talking about, what have they seen? What do they think the wider impact will be? And the third task we're going to look at the start of this webinar is, how do you think COVID-19 and the lockdown might have differently impacted boys or girls? Have you noticed any difference in impact? And you may not have done. This may be something that you think on and that things come up later and you think, oh, maybe that has impacted them differently. But have you noticed any difference in how girls deal with things and how boys deal with things? It's sort of sweeping generalizations in one sense, but also it's important to think about, is gender playing a part in this? So that's the third task. What have you noticed? Have you noticed a difference? This may, as I say, be something you want to look at later. It may not be something you've initially seen or that's come up in conversation. Think about it. So the point of today's session is a bit of a whistle-stop tour around what we know about the gender sport gap in schools pre-COVID-19, the ways in which COVID-19 has sent maybe more gendered messages to girls and boys about gender in general, and specifically about gender and sports. The idea is not to tell you what is definitely happening to pupils in your school or children that you know, but to give you a flavour of the research that is out there and the messages that your pupils might be seeing in other places, which might then have an impact on what they choose to do at school. And I say choose like that because it's in sort of speech marks. What they choose to do might not be what they would choose to do if the environment was different. It might just be what they do and don't feel confident doing. So looking at our slides, the first slide is full of some clouds, and the clouds all have statistics in there. And these clouds, it's a busy slide, but it's important. So these clouds are telling us what was going on before the initial COVID-19 lockdown. So in March, in the end of February and March 2020, what was going on around the gender sport gap. And a lot of this is just the work that we do with schools, but these are all statistics coming from all over. And the big headline really was that in the bottom right hand corner, we know that the position was actually before lockdown, the gap was closing, the gender sport gap was closing. And how do we know that? Because the Sport England Active Live survey was released in April 2020, and that gave us the statistics for the year to November 2019. And there were some brilliant statistics in there that showed that 28.6 million adults were active, doing at least 150 minutes of moderate activity a week. That was 63.3% of the nation's population and was up by nearly 405,000 people on the previous 12 months, which was great. They also showed that there were nearly 160,000 fewer inactive people, those not doing at least their 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity a week, than the previous 12 months. There was a drop in the activity levels of people aged 16 to 34, with those classes active falling by about 1.7%. So not a massive drop, but interesting. But the big good news for the gender gap was that the gender gap was smaller than it had been previously. Particularly, there had been increases across the board driven by rises in numbers of women, adults aged 55 plus, and disabled people or people with long-term health conditions being active. And these are all areas where Sport England had focused significant investment over the last few years. So campaigns like This Girl Can and We Are Undefeatable, they had particular focus on these areas, and that's where they'd seen the impact. So that was all great. But the wider picture and the wider context for girls and boys in schools was, and if you've worked with Totally Runable before or you've seen any of the sessions that we've done, it wasn't great. So we know that girls begin to doubt their sporting ability age 7. That was Government Equalities Office research in 2015. We did some research off the back of that with 4 primary schools, about 354 key stage 2 children. And the first question we asked them in surveys, so we did surveys, focus groups. There's a report on our website called Don't Be a Girl About It, which is all of our findings from that. It was a project in collaboration with the Australia Academy Trust and the Laurel Trust Educational Research Funding. So have a look on Totally Runable's website for that in our resources section, and you can read the full report. But the headline really for the first question we asked them in surveys, so we asked, how sporty are you? And we knew by age 7, by year 3, girls were 22% less likely to call themselves very sporty than boys. We also knew when we asked that question that in general, it was great. Between 80 and 90% of every year group at Key Stage 2 said they were very sporty or quite sporty, which is brilliant. You know, you may not get, although we've seen increases in Sport England statistics, you may not get between 80 and 90% of adults in England saying that they were quite sporty or very sporty. So that's great. We're doing something really well in schools, is what that tells me. But when we split that by the genders, we were seeing girls saying they were quite sporty, even where objectively they were very sporty, and boys saying they were very sporty, even where objectively they weren't as sporty. So actually there is something going on there in the reporting of that, in how they see themselves or how they want to report themselves. We know, for example, that the biggest fall in participation occurs during the transition from primary to secondary school, so around age 11. We know that from Girl Guiding research. So if there's a gap at primary school, it gets worse by secondary. We keep hearing from secondary PE teachers and other teaching staff that year 8 is when girls will inevitably lose confidence in sport, unless they are doing some really strong, really hard work to counter that. 75% of women and girls aged 14 to 40 want to be more physically active but report fear of judgment. And that comes from the Sport England This Girl Can campaign. We put that statistic in with some other statistics. So we know that around 85% of primary teachers in this country are female. Put that with the 75% of women and girls want to be more physically active but report fear of judgment. Potentially, we've got 2/3 of all primary teachers wanting to be more physically active but reporting a fear of judgment. Add to that the possibly 6 hours on average of PE and sport training on the average PGCE course, and a PE and sport premium budget that's often completely innocently been spent on other people coming in and delivering PE, maybe so that teaching staff don't have to. Maybe the intention is to get the teaching staff to be upskilled, but actually things come up and that doesn't happen for one reason or another. Actually, there's no wonder that teaching confidence generally in PE isn't as high as it could be. And we do need to get past it just being not something people are into. There might be a reason. If you've got staff who aren't confident in delivering PE, or they aren't confident in their own physical ability, they're not going to be confident in delivering PE. That stands to reason. So actually it's about building their confidence maybe. We know that boys are more likely to be active than girls. We know that in England, 43% of girls achieve the recommended amount of sport and physical activity compared with 51% of boys. So a big gap there. We know from our benchmarking, so we do some benchmarking as part of a tool where we help schools measure and close the gender sport gap. And we do a benchmarking exercise where we know that across around 6,000 children last year, we know that there was a gap of 166 metres on average, where boys average between Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, 166 metres was the difference. Boys were running an average of 166 metres further in either 10 minutes or 15 minutes, averaged across. And that's a major concern to me, because that tells me that, at primary school age, there should be no physical reason why girls and boys should perform differently in a running-based challenge like that. And that is an entirely socialized difference. And particularly, as I say, by year 5 and 6, girls will often have had a growth spurt that boys won't have until year 7 and 8. So girls should outperform boys by year 5 and 6 in theory, but that's not what we see. So if that is something your school might be interested in, we can definitely have a chat about how we would go about coming and doing a benchmarking exercise to help you measure your gender sport gap. And we know that media coverage of men's sport was still significantly higher than women's sport, despite some progress. So we did some research in 2018 that looked at the 9 national newspapers. We were looking at in 2014, the No More Page 3 campaign that was trying to ban page 3 in the Sun newspaper, looked at the Sun newspaper for a period of 6 months, and they didn't find one picture of a woman playing sport. So I was using this in conversation, and I was using it in sessions like this, and I had a lot of people say to me, well, it can't be that bad now, or it can't be that bad across the board. And so we said, well, what we will do is we will take the 9 national newspapers, we will tally up the number of photos, we will look at how many are pictures of men playing, how many pictures are of somebody playing sport, how many of those are women. And we had about 3,100 pictures across the 1 day a month for a year across the 9 newspapers, and 2.9% of those were of women playing sport. The interesting thing was that we quite often saw different things, did different things in terms of how women and how men were presented. So there were more pictures of sports women than there were of pictures of women playing sports, because sports women were quite often pictured in dresses holding trophies, smiling. They weren't pictured doing the sport, whereas in a story about a male athlete who'd won an award, the picture would be him playing the sport. There was a one particular day sticks in my mind because there was a picture of so Andy Murray and Johanna Konta had got through to the same stage of the same tennis tournament, and the 2 pictures were the same size, which is unusual because on average the sizes of the pictures of men playing sport were bigger than sizes of pictures of women playing sport, but the 2 pictures were the same size. But Andy Murray was hitting a tennis ball, I think just warming up for his game, hitting a ball. But Johanna Konta was sort of smiling, turning as if somebody had just called her, and she just turned. She was just carrying she was in kit, but she was carrying her racket bag. So she wasn't playing the sport. There was also a picture of an athletics track, and there's a beautiful picture of our GB men's relay team, and the story was that our men's and women's relay teams had both medalled at the competition that they'd been competing at. Our men's relay team had got a bronze and our women's relay team had got a silver, so the women had objectively outperformed the men in terms of the rankings. And the picture of the men was a beautiful picture of the track with all the athletes running, really trying their hardest. It would be an amazing role model picture to use in a school. But the picture that was the men's team, but the picture of the women's team was our 4 best female athletes in the country in that event, leaping in the air with a flag behind them. And that always sticks in my mind because it was just such an obvious difference in how we see male athletes and female athletes in the media. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily 7-year-old girls are reading newspapers or 7-year-old boys, but actually it's a useful litmus test about what's going on in the media and what are we not really seeing that we're seeing, or what are we not seeing that we assume we are seeing. So that was interesting. Feedback on my screen, but in terms of the other things that we know, once we look at what was going on, we know that despite all of this, there was a lot of brilliant work going on. So we know that the schools that we were working in were doing some really great work looking at the gender stereotypes they'd seen in school. We have a staff workshop that we've done with a lot of schools, and we get some really good feedback in there from what's going on. We know how easy it is to send these messages accidentally or not realize what you're sending, but actually also how easy it is to change those messages with just some tweaks here and there. But it's about everybody knowing, it's about everybody being on side with that. So that's a bit of pre-COVID where we were at. Post-COVID, or in a COVID era, or looking ahead, where are we? So the first thing we're going to look at is some research that came out early in the original UK lockdown. So this came out earlier in the year, and it's probably not a surprise to you. So obviously we've seen some brilliant things going on in the PE and sport communities. We've seen the fabulous Joe Wicks with his fitness stuff going on. We've seen things like #ThisIsPE, and if you haven't seen that, I would definitely have a search back on social media for #ThisIsPE. Some really interesting activities that children can try at home. But what this research told us was that physical activity is good for us, and lockdowns impact our ability to exercise. So this is something that's been referenced internationally around government decisions on lockdowns, and was in an article in the Journal of Occupational Medicine and Toxicology. So there's a couple of quotes there. It is reasonable to assume that lockdown leads to reduced levels of physical activity in the general population. Physical activity has the potential to ward off detrimental cardiometabolic effects of inactivity and to strengthen psychological resources and coping skills. So that won't come as a surprise to you, but always nice to have things confirmed by research. This slide is a summary really of what has gone on in terms of COVID-19 and what has the lockdown impact been on women and girls in general. And the first thing to say here really is that we know that COVID-19 itself has a worse effect medically on men. And there is some research on that. There's things going on in terms of looking into that. But whilst the number of cases globally where sex aggregated data has been recorded from country to country is similar between men and women, so similar number of cases, men are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than women. So that I'm certainly not suggesting anything other than that. That's what the science says. The cause of it is unclear, maybe to do with physical factors, chromosomal structures, lifestyle differences, particularly smoking and alcohol consumption have been said to play a part in that. But what is interesting in terms of the societal impacts and what we are seeing is that the impact on women and girls across the board has been disproportionate on a societal level. So there's been a lot in the news and in research papers around this topic, but these are just some of the ways that COVID-19 and lockdowns and the idea of a lockdown to solve the COVID-19 issue and the lockdown in the UK has impacted women and girls. So we have seen increases in violence against women and increases in domestic violence. We have seen an impact on the healthcare workers that are working within the healthcare industry. So 70% of healthcare workers globally are female. 21% of all women employed in the UK do health and social care work. So just by default, there is an impact there that it is an interesting statistic. There's a consequential impact on women's health issues. So there's been a lot of initial questions on this, and I'm intrigued to see what the research tells us on this. But period poverty, any issues that were going on previously are going to be exacerbated by a lockdown and by lack of mixing and lack of social interaction. So that's an interesting and upsetting potential difference in impact. We know from statistics that economically women are less able to absorb loss than men. So women often earn less, save less, and are the majority of single parent households. So there's less access to social protection in there. In the UK, for example, women were 1.5 times more likely to have been forced to quit or lose jobs due to the first lockdown than men. And this bleeds into the next point down, really. Women do 80% of unpaid childcare in the UK in normal times. And lockdown has exacerbated this, children being at home, stretched healthcare systems. If you are interested in reading more about this and the ways that society in general has massive gender gaps and has statistics gender gaps, so the research that goes into making decisions about things that go on in our everyday lives, from how many toilets there are in when architects are designing buildings, how much space there is for toilets, or what goes on in how they design safety systems for cars, so seatbelts. There is a brilliant book called Invisible Women by Criado Perez, and I would urge everybody to read it. It's so interesting, around structural sexism and a lack of data and all the interesting impacts that it has on that. Young people have also been impacted. So by the end of March 2020, 89% of the global student population were out of school or university due to lockdowns, and 2/3 of those not in education or training globally are young women. So that is having a big impact globally. We know that in the UK, Plan International had some research that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 girls were reporting increased harassment on the streets during lockdown. And that is something that, particularly for those of us who run, so I'm a runner and I obviously get a lot of stories from other runners that I know, that there is harassment on the streets every so often. It's usually played down by the women who experience it. I know I've certainly had things shouted at me out of cars while I was running that aren't okay. And whilst I don't want to blow that out of proportion, actually interesting to find out what's gone on statistically since lockdown happening. And the statistic that we saw that was a third of UK women are suffering lockdown loneliness. And I'm certainly not suggesting that is something exclusive to women. 18% of men were saying the same thing, but actually some of those other statistics, like women being more likely to be at home with their children, or women being less likely to have jobs that they're able to move around or do things differently, so having to lose jobs or that kind of thing, has potentially impacted on this statistic of a third of UK women suffering lockdown loneliness. I do want to say that I'm not suggesting that the impact of COVID and the lockdowns has been purely on women, and I know that, particularly talking to men who work in schools, for example, you have had a lot of what might be seen as more commonly the roles that women would do in terms of care for children or things like that. I've certainly got friends who work in schools who have done at least as much as their partners have done in looking after children. But these are interesting statistics, and I do think they need to be considered within the context of actually what's going on a societal basis, not just the things that go around the lockdowns, not just the lockdowns themselves. So now we're going to have a quick look at the impact that lockdown has had on particularly women and girls in sport. So women and girls in sport, this is something that directly is related to what your pupils are seeing, what children that you know are seeing. If they're not already seeing that additional impact of what's going on and what are the women and what are the men in their lives doing and how are they seeing that, this is specific to women and girls in sport. So we know that media coverage of women's sport remains poor. Even during lockdown, it was poor. We started a podcast, like a classic. What did you do during lockdown? We started a podcast that's totally runnable. So the team are behind the C Sporty, B Sporty podcast. So there's a couple of episodes online for that. So wherever you get your podcast, search for C Sporty, B Sporty, the podcast, and you'll hopefully find us there. And before the 2 episodes that we did in the summer, we looked at what was going on in those newspapers, what was happening now. So the stories that were in the newspapers. And it was really interesting to see that even at a time where sport was not going on, at that time, remember, there was no sport happening, amateur, professional, men's or women's, no sport was going on. But even then, the stories and the pictures in the newspaper were disproportionate amounts of men's sport and much less women's sport. That, for me, would have been an opportunity for newspapers and the media in general to think outside the box a little bit, to look at where can we get additional stories, where can we get news stories, what can we do? And actually, there was some of that, some great stuff going on, particularly around the Telegraph has a women's sports supplement that comes monthly, that's brilliant. But actually, the day-to-day, there wasn't any more than we saw 2 years ago. So even where there was no sport happening, media coverage was massively skewed to reporting a lack of men's sport as opposed to a lack of women's sport. We are doing some brilliant work with local newspapers. So we've done some work with the Wakefield Express and with the Loughborough Echo, where we are actually involved in writing some articles for them, interviewing some sportswomen. And both of those, actually, the Wakefield Express and Loughborough Echo, I should say, are brilliant at reporting women's sport in general anyway, particularly locally. But that's partly why they're so open to a relationship with us to do something on role model female sports people over the next few months as a result of our research on this. So look out for those if you're in those areas, or look out on our social media. We are on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. It's all just at Totally Runnable. So here, this is the COVID-19 and lockdown impacts on women and girls. We know more generally that the position in terms of the media hasn't improved massively. What we also know is that research has shown a drop in activity levels. So we had some initial research, Sport England research in the first lockdown, early in the first lockdown, was really positive. It showed that girls were being more active, the gender gap was closing. I remember at the time approaching this fairly cautiously, but with optimism, because what I didn't want was for that to be girls were being more active and the gender gap was closing because girls were finally comfortable to go out and go for a run when that was all there was to do and nobody was going to see you and it was about not being seen, or it was the only way they were comfortable with getting active. So I was cautious about that, and actually we have seen further research since that has shown a drop in activity levels. And we've seen comments from Tim Hollingsworth, the Chief Executive of Sport England, saying he was concerned about that from May onwards, really. So we know that 42% of women compared with 35% of men have reported a drop in activity levels. And of those, almost a quarter of women said that they were exercising a lot less. Meanwhile, only 10% are saying they're exercising a lot more. So interesting statistics there, and not good in terms of the disproportionate impact on women. Women in sport have done some really interesting research, and their findings, we've got 3 of their findings on the screen here. 39% of women said that losing their fitness would have a long-term impact. A quarter, 25% of women were worried that getting back into the habit of exercise post-lockdown would be hard. And obviously that was post the initial lockdown. What's happened since? We had the summer period. We've now gone into another period of tier 1, 2, 3 restrictions, another lockdown. What's going to happen moving forward? 32% of women said that they couldn't prioritize exercise during lockdown as they had too much to do for others. So that whole thing of, if we know that 80% of unpaid care in the country is done by women, and 80%, and that's what children are seeing, the women in their lives doing 80% of the unpaid care, whether that's for elderly relatives or for children. That has been exacerbated through lockdown, and that is something that is impacting on the role models that children are seeing, whether that's through school or through the people that they engage with, within a school context, or the people they engage with at home. Some girl guiding research has come out, which is really interesting. Girls aged 11 to 18 have reported doing less physical activity, which backs up what's been found in the other research. But there was a really interesting spin on that in terms of being expected to help around the house more than their dad or their brothers. So that's interesting as well. What's going on in the lives of girls when their lives are scaled down and scaled back, and they're in the house? What is going on? What is expected of girls and boys? And actually, schools have no control over that, but schools are going to have to deal with the fallout from that once they come back to school, or once we are back out of lockdown. We've seen in the last week or two, we've seen some differences in treatment of youth sport. So in what's being called lockdown 2.0, which we are currently in the midst of, we are seeing differences in how elite sport is being treated. So particularly around the football situation. So girls and boys football, elite girls and boys football are being treated differently, in that elite boys football is being considered elite and are being allowed to continue, whereas girls football, even at the elite levels, isn't being considered as elite. And so there is an issue there in terms of girls being stopped from playing because they are more amateur in setup rather than in their skills. And rather than, they're the best in the country, but somehow their gender is the problem for them being physically active. But it's a structural issue. It isn't somebody looking and saying, well, you're girls, you can't do it. It is more of a structural issue about what's in place around that. So it's more complicated. And that, I think, is one of the big messages from this webinar. It is more complicated than we think always, but actually that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about it. So finally, what I'd like to give you is some quick wins for your school. So if you are looking at this thinking, well, I don't know what's going on, I don't know how I can impact this. Our message really is that research is showing a difference between the societal impact of lockdown and COVID-19 so far on key areas for women and girls. And if pre-lockdown, girls were less likely to be engaging in and confident in sport and suffering from a lack of role models, it is now even more important than ever to redress that balance with how we are approaching potential gender sport gaps in our schools. And we have a session, so we do some one-off workshops, we do longer 6-week courses, we do one-off workshops with staff, we do one-off workshops with pupils, and in our year 5 and 6 workshops, we have a session where we talk about statistics. So in the girls workshop, they know that it's about girls and boys in sport, but in the boys workshop, they think it's a made up world where half the people have got purple hair and half the people have got green hair. But essentially the statistics that we use, that we outrage all the children with, are the unfair statistics, some of which we've seen here, about girls and boys in sport. But once we have outraged them, we ask them, what happens if you're, so are you happy about this, is the first question. And I don't think anybody looking at this can be happy about it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in terms of schools that we work with, nobody is happy that there is a gender gap, that there is any gap that treats children differently by the school treating them all the same. What we need to do is, you would never treat all the children the same if they needed different things in other areas. Why do we do that in terms of PE and sport and physical activity when they are being sent such different messages from the wider world? So what we ask them in this workshop is, if you're not happy with it, but you don't do anything, what happens? Well, it doesn't improve. Nothing gets better by us not doing anything about it. But actually it might even get worse. So in which case, these are the things we can do about it. So this is positive takeaway for you, whether you think you have a gender sport gap in your school or not. Number one, measure your gender sport gap. I don't think you can do anything more important than measuring that. And whether, what you measure, you improve, as the saying goes. And whether you have a gender sport gap or whether you don't, you actually don't know what the gap might be until you measure it. We have a tool that does this for schools, and quite often schools are surprised by the results on that. And we give actual feedback that children have given, and they say, oh, do you know, that makes sense? Or, we hadn't thought of it like that. Or even if it's generally great and there's not much of a gap, there's always somewhere that they could improve. So this could be informal. It doesn't have to be using our tool. This could be a completely informal chat with staff. Look at what's going on in the playground. What happens in the playground? What are girls doing? What are boys doing? Is there a gender gap? Are there any groups who are doing different things that actually gender is the difference there? Look at what's happened maybe in previous years, if it's not happening right now, with attendance at after school clubs or lunchtime clubs. Is there a difference between what girls do and what boys do in who is attending, who is competing for the school, who's, you know, putting their hand up to compete, what clubs they're attending? So is it, remember that, you know, there shouldn't be any difference in ability physically at primary school. If there is, then it's likely there's something socialized going on. Are we seeing girls doing gymnastics and dance and boys doing football and not the opposite? Are we seeing those stereotypical things? If so, there is more that can be done, because people will say things like, and I'm picking on football, but people will say things like, oh, the girls just don't want to play football. The girls have probably not tried it, or tried it to the extent that they know. They might be on the face of it choosing not to do something, but actually, if what we say to them is, oh, if you don't want to do football, what do you want to do? This other thing. Well, they might well pick that because you're channeling them into that. It's about thinking about actually what's going on. What are they doing? Number 2 is normalizing physical activity for everyone. So we have just been part of a project called Hit the Ground Running. So we partnered with the Yorkshire Sport Foundation for schools across West Yorkshire over this term. And it's a Hit the Ground Running project where basically it isn't a big deal for everybody to be expected to do some physical activity. So everybody's gone outside and done a run every day, and there's been a competition. That kind of thing, a daily mile, you know, a normalized physical activity that goes on every day or several times a week. If you can get teachers involved, even better, because they'll be fantastic role models for pupils, particularly if they aren't stereotypically sporty. It's just normalizing physical activity. If you do get resistance from staff to being involved in this kind of thing, think about why that might be the case. Is it their confidence in their own physical ability? Don't assume anything, because I certainly wouldn't say women aren't confident about sport. That's not what I'm saying. But in particular, I mean, and some men are not confident about sport. I'm certainly, you know, saying that as well. But don't assume anything about anybody based on their gender, but be sensitive to the fact that male or female staff might have hang-ups about their physical ability. If 85% of primary teachers are female and 75% of women and girls want to be more physically active but fear judgment, that can weigh heavily on a teacher who is expected to be physically active in front of her pupils off the back of 6 hours of PE training on a PGCE, and maybe 20 plus years of messages about what girls and boys are capable of and suited to. So I think making an effort to normalize physical activity, but in a sensitive way for the staff and other role models involved, that's super important. And number 3, as I said at the start, it's the easiest, quickest win for measuring and closing a gender sport gap is to sign up to our Girls in Sport Pledge. It is completely free. You will be joining 200 other schools and organisations who are part of it now. And there is the first thing you'll get is a resource pack with a checklist of things we see that identify a gender sport gap and ways to close it. You'll get a poster for a certificate for your reception, a sticker for reception, poster for your staff room, half-termly newsletters, free CPD sessions like this, and success stories about other schools we've worked with who have done things to measure and close their gender sport gap, and how you can maybe look at to take your own. The last thing I want to mention is that a bit of a bonus heads up, look out for our Role Models poster campaign and podcast series. So we are super excited about this. It will be coming in the spring term. Any school that has signed up for our Girls in Sport Pledge will be on our list to receive our Role Models posters. It is a set of posters and a podcast that will support it that has some absolutely stellar names on the list of guests. So it will be myself and my co-director, Jenny Meadows, who, as you may know, is a former athlete and Olympian and all-round superstar. And she has pulled out the big guns in her contact list to get us some really good guests for that. So definitely look out for that. This is my information. So our website is totallyrunnable.com. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at totallyrunnable. I'm on LinkedIn, Natalie Jackson. My email is nat@totallyrunnable.com. And my phone number is on there as well if you want to get in touch with me. It has been an absolute pleasure having you with me today. I hope that I've given you some interesting takeaway to think about and take forward. And if we can help in absolutely any way, you know where we are. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and thanks for joining me. Bye.